It started as a practical decision, renting out the small studio in my backyard. Times were tough, and the extra income helped cover rising expenses. It wasn't fancy, just a cozy little space with a bed, bathroom, and kitchenette, ideal for travelers or short-term stays. I managed it all through Airbnb, and everything had always gone smoothly. Until last week. A new booking came in from a man named Lucas. He seemed polite in his early 30s, and mentioned he'd be staying for 2 nights while in town for a job interview. His message was courteous, even thanking me in advance. Nothing about it raised any alarms. The check-in was seamless. I sent him the code for the smart lock, and that was that. 2 days later, at checkout time, I headed over to the studio to clean and prepare it for the next guest. When I opened the door, I paused. The studio was spotless. The bed was perfectly made, the towels hung neatly, and there wasn't a speck of trash anywhere. It wasn't unusual for guests to leave things tidy, but this level of precision felt off, almost too perfect. I brushed it off as politeness and got to work. As I moved into the bathroom, my stomach twisted. The complimentary toothbrush I always left for guests wasn't in its usual spot. It had been moved, just slightly, but enough to catch my attention. A small detail, but it gnawed at me. Feeling uneasy, I decided to check the security footage from the camera overlooking the studio's entrance. It was a habit I'd developed whenever something felt out of place. As I skimmed through the clips, everything seemed normal at first. Lucas arrived on the first day with just a backpack, waved at the camera, and let himself in. But then, on the second night, at around 11 p.m., the footage showed another man entering the studio. My heart skipped. He wasn't on the reservation, and Lucas hadn't mentioned bringing anyone. The stranger carried a large bag, walked in confidently using the same lock code, and never left. The next morning, Lucas was seen leaving the studio alone. But the other man? There was no footage of him walking out. It was as if he'd vanished. Later that night, as I sat in my living room trying to make sense of it all, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you lock the window?" I froze. My stomach dropped like a stone. The only window I had locked was the bathroom window earlier that day, left slightly ajar when I first arrived to clean. Someone had been watching me. Panicked, I debated calling the police. But what would I say? There wasn't any solid proof someone was still in the studio. Instead, I blocked the number and tried to sleep, though every creak and whisper of the night sent shivers up my spine. The next morning, I went through the footage again. This time, I scoured every second. That's when I saw it. Around 2 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared near the studio door. They didn't try to enter, they just stood there, watching. For over 20 minutes, they remained still before melting back into the darkness. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the police and explained everything. Lucas, the stranger, the messages, and the footage. 2 officers came to inspect the studio while another questioned me. They searched the place top to bottom. For a moment, I thought they'd find nothing, leaving me to feel like a paranoid fool. But then one of them called me over. Under the bed, they'd found something I hadn't noticed before. A small hole in the wooden floorboards. It wasn't big, but it was large enough to hide something, or someone. They removed the mattress and frame to inspect further. What they found made my skin crawl. Beneath the bed was a hidden compartment. It was empty now, but it reeked of stale air, sweat, and something else I couldn't place. Whoever had been there was gone, but they'd been hiding just feet away from me, possibly for days. The officers didn't say much, just advised me to keep the studio locked and consider adding more cameras. I nodded, though my mind was spiraling. As they left, I stared at that compartment, feeling like it was staring back at me, a dark, gaping reminder of my shattered sense of safety. That night, as I lay in bed, my phone buzzed again, A new message from another unknown number. "I'll be back." My blood turned to ice. The number was different, so blocking it wouldn't matter. Sleep was out of the question. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. By morning, I made a decision. I delisted the studio from Airbnb and vowed never to rent it out again. It wasn't worth the risk. The messages stopped after that, but the fear hasn't left. Sometimes late at night, I think about that hidden compartment under the bed, and the man who disappeared without a trace. Who was he? And what was he planning? I'll probably never know. But I can't shake the feeling that one day, I might look out my window and see him standing there in the dark, waiting. The wind whispered through the trees like a warning. I was 28, stuck in a rut, and desperate for a break from the monotony of my life. My tiny apartment felt suffocating, and my job barely paid the bills. The pandemic had only made things worse. One particularly grueling week left me drained, frustrated, and craving escape. That's when I found it. The Airbnb listing that seemed like salvation. The cabin was tucked away in a forgotten village called Maplewood, 3 hours from the city. Its charm was its simplicity, cozy, isolated, and surrounded by dense woods. Exactly what I needed to disconnect and recharge. But if I had known what awaited me there, I would have never packed my bags. The village was unsettlingly quiet, as though it had been frozen in time. Cracked sidewalks, peeling paint on old houses, and streets devoid of people gave it an eerie charm. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, its wooden exterior almost blending into the shadows of the towering trees. As soon as I stepped out of my car, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. I brushed it off, blaming exhaustion. Inside, the cabin was everything the pictures promised. Small, warm, and inviting. The owner had left detailed instructions on how to turn on the electricity and lock the doors. That night, I made a quick snack, fired up my laptop, and let the glow of a movie fill the otherwise dark and silent space. Outside, the woods seemed to close in, the wind weaving through the branches in a mournful sigh. The Wi-Fi sputtered out before I could finish the film, so I decided to call it a night. I double-checked the locks on every door and window. Being in such an isolated spot made me cautious. Little did I know, locked doors wouldn't be enough. The next morning, I woke to a world that felt untouched by time. I sipped coffee on the porch, the crisp air biting my skin. Deciding to explore, I followed a narrow trail that led to a small lake. Along the way, I passed abandoned houses, their windows like blackened eyes staring into nothingness. One had a rusted bike leaning against the porch railing. It looked as though its owner had vanished mid-ride. A chill crawled up my spine, but I told myself I was overthinking. When I returned to the cabin for lunch, something immediately felt wrong. The back door, locked the night before, was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. Could I have forgotten to lock it? The wind wasn't strong enough to push it open, yet here it was, inviting something unseen. I searched the cabin, every creak of the floorboards amplifying my unease. Nothing seemed out of place, but that feeling of being watched crept in, settling deep in my bones. Later that afternoon, while I was making a sandwich, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside. Crunch, crunch. The sound of leaves being crushed underfoot. I froze, the knife in my hand trembling. It wasn't an animal. This was human. My heart thundered as I peered through the curtain, my breath fogging the glass. At first I saw nothing, just shadows stretching between the trees. But then a figure emerged. It stood motionless, half shrouded in darkness, its outline barely illuminated by the fading sunlight. My stomach twisted. Who would be out here? Why weren't they moving? I ducked beneath the window, my chest heaving. Minutes passed like hours. The footsteps resumed, retreating this time, but I couldn't relax. That night I sat in darkness, every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind setting my nerves on edge. Then came a sound that made my blood run cold, a scraping against the side of the cabin, like nails dragging along the wood. I grabbed the largest knife I could find and crouched in the corner, my back pressed against the wall. The scraping stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt alive. Then a new horror, on the living room window, a smudged handprint. It hadn't been there earlier. My heart pounded like a drum as I scanned the rest of the windows with a flashlight. That's when I saw them. A face, or the suggestion of one. Pale and featureless, staring back at me from the darkness. I choked on a gasp and stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to hide, and I bolted to the bedroom, locking the door and shoving the dresser against it. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and then I heard it. Footsteps inside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, and unhurried. They didn't try to mask their presence. They wanted me to know they were there. The doorknob rattled. My breath hitched. I gripped the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rattling stopped, replaced by silence. Then the footsteps retreated, and I heard the front door creak open and close. I waited until dawn, unable to move, barely able to breathe. When the first light of day touched the cabin, I packed my things in a frenzy and fled, never looking back. As I sped away, the trees seemed to close in behind me, swallowing the dirt road whole. Back home, I scoured the Airbnb reviews, desperate for answers. What I found chilled me to my core. Multiple guests had reported feeling watched, and one mentioned the owner dropping by unannounced late at night. I never saw the owner during my stay, but the possibility that they had been involved made my skin crawl. To this day, I don't know who or what was outside that cabin, how they got inside, or why they left me unharmed. All I know is that the silence of Maplewood wasn't peace. It was a predator waiting to pounce. And I'll never escape the memory of those smudged handprints and faceless stares. They say your gut never lies, but I didn't listen to mine the day I moved into that old apartment on the 3rd floor. It was small and modest, nothing special, but perfect for starting over after landing a new job. For the first week, the place was eerily silent, almost too quiet. It wasn't until the 7th night that the quiet was shattered by something I'll never forget. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Here's the thing. I lived on the top floor. No one should have been above me. At first, I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But the footsteps returned, more distinct, more deliberate. Then came the scratching. Late one night, I lay frozen in bed as something or someone scraped against the wall near my headboard. The next morning, my nerves frayed. I casually mentioned the noises to Mara, my downstairs neighbor. Her face instantly fell, her casual demeanor shifting to something colder, darker. "The guy before you complained about hearing the same things," she said, her voice low. Footsteps, scratching. He even said he felt like someone was in the apartment with him. He left suddenly, didn't even bother giving notice. Her words chilled me, but I laughed nervously, brushing it off. That night, determined to prove to myself I was overreacting, I left my phone on record mode as I slept. The next morning, I played it back, half expecting nothing but silence. Instead, I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps. Worse still, there was the sound of breathing, slow, deep, and unnervingly close, like someone standing right next to my bed. By then, I couldn't deny that something was wrong. I left all the lights on that night, hoping the brightness would scare off whatever was haunting me. But it didn't work. Around midnight, a loud crash from the kitchen jolted me awake. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept toward the sound. The kitchen looked normal, except for a faint drag mark on the tiled floor, as though something heavy had been pulled across it. Too spooked to investigate further, I decided to deal with it in the morning. While cleaning the kitchen the next day, I noticed a small vent near the floor I hadn't paid attention to before. Curious, I unscrewed the cover and found a crumpled piece of paper stuffed inside. Unfolding it, I realized it was an old, faded photo. The image was haunting. A man in a hood standing in front of a door, my door. I called my friend Jake and begged him to come over. Laughing at my paranoia, he agreed to stay the night. But even his bravado crumbled when, while watching TV around midnight, we heard soft, deliberate creaking coming from the bathroom. The door was ajar, even though I distinctly remembered closing it. Inside, the bathroom seemed normal, until we noticed a faint smudge in the corner of the mirror, almost like a damp fingerprint. When I tried to wipe it away, it wouldn't budge, as if it had been burned into the glass. Jake, visibly rattled, suggested we sleep in the living room instead. The next morning, I decided I had to get to the bottom of things. I remembered the attic access in the hallway outside my apartment. Jake, though reluctant, came with me. We pulled down the creaky ladder and climbed into the cramped, dust-covered space. In the far corner, our flashlights illuminated something that made my stomach churn. A filthy, stained mattress surrounded by empty food wrappers and crumpled papers. Someone had been living up there. And then we heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate creaks coming from the hallway below. Jake and I froze as the sound grew louder, closer. Then the ladder began to shift. Someone, or something, was climbing up. Panic overtook us. I grabbed Jake and we scrambled down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the police station. When we returned with an officer, my apartment door was wide open. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. Furniture I had rearranged was back in its original position, as though someone, or something, had erased any sign of what had happened. The attic, too, was empty. The mattress, the papers, the wrappers, gone. It was as if no one had ever been there. The officer dismissed it as my imagination, or a squatter pulling a prank. But deep down, I knew better. I packed up and left that same day. I didn't care about my deposit or explaining myself to the landlord. I just wanted out. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched the entire time I lived there. Whatever was in that apartment, it didn't want me to leave, and it sure as hell didn't want me to stay. At the beginning of 2023, I found myself scrambling to book a last-minute trip to Chicago for a job interview. Everything about it felt rushed and unplanned. I didn't want to spend a fortune, so I settled on an Airbnb in a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with. The photos seemed decent, but something about the host's profile gave me an uneasy feeling. It was bare, just a generic name, no profile picture, and hardly any information. I hesitated, but the location was convenient, and the price was unbeatable. It's just 2 nights, I told myself, ignoring the creeping unease. The sense of dread hit me again when I arrived. The house looked older, more run down than the picture suggested, with peeling paint and an air of neglect. The street was eerily quiet, unsettlingly so for early evening. I brushed it off and found the key where the host said it would be, hidden under a flower pot on the porch. Inside, the house was small and musty, filled with outdated furniture that seemed frozen in time. It wasn't dangerous looking, just off. What unsettled me the most was the front door lock. It felt flimsy, like it wouldn't stand up to even a half-hearted shove. Then as I explored the house, I noticed the back door. It wasn't locked, it wasn't even latched properly. A cold chill ran down my spine. I locked it immediately with a key I found hanging nearby, but that offered little comfort. I tried distracting myself by streaming a movie, but the Wi-Fi was so terrible I gave up. By 10 p.m., I decided to sleep. That's when the night spiraled into a waking nightmare. Lying in bed, I couldn't relax. The house seemed alive, every creak of the old wood amplified in the silence. Then I heard it. A faint noise coming from the back of the house, the back door. It sounded like someone was testing the handle. My heart raced, but I told myself it was the wind. I stayed perfectly still, ears straining for any hint of sound. A few moments of silence passed, and I started convincing myself I was imagining things. That's when the footsteps started. Clear and deliberate, they crunched against the gravel outside, heading straight for the window next to my bed. I froze, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The curtains were drawn, but I could feel the presence just beyond them. The footsteps stopped. Whoever it was stood there, unmoving. I didn't dare breathe. Suddenly the steps retreated, slow and measured, heading toward the front of the house. I heard the distinct sound of someone jiggling the front doorknob. Panic surged through me. I crept toward the door, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the peephole. Darkness. Just pure black. Then the doorbell rang. It was a single, eerie chime, like someone testing the waters. My stomach dropped. A few seconds later it rang again, louder. I held my breath as a low voice whispered something just beyond the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was deliberate, chilling. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, creating a makeshift barricade. My hands trembled as I texted the Airbnb host, asking if they or someone they knew might be at the door. No reply. The voice outside had gone silent, but now I heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving along the side of the house. Then a metallic scraping noise, like someone dragging something heavy along the ground. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself they had left when I heard the unmistakable rattle of the back door handle. They were trying to get in. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911. Before the dispatcher answered, I heard that low, guttural voice again, louder this time. "I know you're in there," I whispered into the phone, describing what was happening. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. I locked myself in the bedroom, wedging a dresser against the door. The house was deathly silent, except for my shaky breathing. Then a loud crash echoed from the living room. The dispatcher asked what happened, but all I could manage to whisper was, "Someone's inside." Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed down the hallway, each step closer to my door. My whole body tensed as the doorknob jiggled violently. I screamed, "The police are on their way." The rattling stopped. Silence. Then, finally, the sweet sound of sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights washed over the walls as officers arrived, banging on the front door. When I finally unlocked the bedroom door, my legs felt like jelly as I stumbled to meet them. They searched the house but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no intruder, nothing. But as one officer assured me everything was clear, I noticed the back door. It was wide open. The officer's expression darkened when I insisted I had locked it. They promised to check nearby surveillance cameras, though I could tell they didn't expect to find much. I called a friend in Chicago and explained everything. He urged me to come to his place immediately, and I didn't need to be told twice. As I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. The next day, the police called. They found nothing on the cameras, but their words left me ice cold. The back door wasn't forced. Whoever opened it had a key or knew how to unlock it. The host never responded to my follow-ups, and to this day I don't know who or what was in that house. But one thing is certain, I'll never ignore my gut feeling again.